Hi Excel lovers, my name is Lenny Wu. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk about 6 pivot table best practices. Now let's get started. Best practices of pivot table. First, do set up data list as data table so that it is very easy for auto expansion and update. Let me show you how. Now suppose in the data we have 51,000 rows and we want to add more rows below. In the pivot table, now if you check the pivot table range, it is fixed at 51,291 rows. It can't automatically expand even if you add some more rows in there, which is not right because sometimes we need to add data to the data table and we want the pivot table to take the updated data sources, not the old original data source. So how to solve that issue? We can, however, use the function of table in Excel. So click any cell in the list and press and hold Control and then press T for table. Here you let Excel to add a table for you and it asks where is the data for your table, and it automatically finds the range of your data table, which is from A1 to R51,291. And there's a check here. My table has headers. The first row of my table is the headers, so I leave the check in there. Click OK. Now this changed into a table. Next time, when you add more rows in there, for example, let's add the last 2 rows and paste it below it. And check this out. Once you paste the value, the table expands automatically. As you can see, the small triangle at the bottom right, which means the table used to be at 51,209 rows, expanded 2 more rows. So by using table function, you automatically expand or contract the range for the table, making it easy for pivot table to update the data. Perfect. Number 2, do assign a table name for easy reference by pivot tables. So in Excel, let's go to the table we just created and select Table Design. In the top left, it says Table Name. Here, Excel put a default name of Table 2 to your table. You can simply customize this table to, for example, Data Source and press Enter. Done. So this table is renamed to a specific name, Data Source. Going forward, for a pivot table, you can easily refer to this table name. One point that's worth mentioning is that when you assign a table name, do not leave any space in there. For example, Data Source. When you press Enter, it throws you an error message saying the syntax of name should not include a space. So simply use an underscore, just like we did before. Click Enter. Perfect. Number 3, do put multiple pivot tables in multiple tabs. Otherwise, you will receive this error message saying a pivot table report cannot overlap another pivot table report. Let me show you an example in Excel. Suppose in one tab we have 2 pivot tables. For the first pivot tables, we want to add more columns. For example, let's drag and drop region to the columns so that it goes to the right. When you click that, it says pivot table report can overlap another pivot table report because the first pivot table wants to expand to the right, which will overlap with the second pivot table. This error happens all the time. So the best practice is always to include one pivot table in one tab so that the pivot table can expand easily to the right or to the rows below. Perfect. Number 4, Do protect sensitive information such as salary details in your pivot table. This is a common error. People include salary information in the pivot table as data, and then they hide or delete the data, simply send the pivot table with the salary information to others, thinking that the viewers cannot see the details. However, pivot table has its own cache or memory of those data. So when you go back to pivot table, this pivot table has a pivot cache, everything included in this data table. So to prove that, simply click the grand total, 13,846,000. You will see you will have the complete set of the data of 51,000 rows. Imagine that some or all of these rows contain sensitive information such as salary details. So to avoid this error of accidentally revealing some sensitive information, click any cell in the pivot table, right-click, pivot table options, data. As you can see, pivot table data, enable show details. Uncheck this box and click OK. So going forward, if someone wants to understand the details of your data, they double-click this cell and nothing happens. This way it will protect your data from being exposed to person not authorized to see those details. Best practice of pivot table number 5. Do create your own pivot table style. Anytime when you find yourself keep changing the pivot table style, you may want to set up your own pivot table style for uniform theme. Let me show you how. Now select your pivot table, go to Design. On the top, you can see Pivot Table Styles. Click the drop-down arrow. Select New Pivot Table Style. We want to assign some style to certain pivot table elements. For example, header row. Let's make it fill blue. OK. And then grand total row. Let's select bold font. Click OK and OK to finish. Now we just created a new pivot table style. It doesn't pop up here. We have to select from the list. Let's click the list. The first style in the custom section is what we created, and we can select that custom one with the blue row header and bold font size for grand total. Perfect. If you change your mind and want to delete this style, you can right-click the customized style and click delete. Now I just show you how to create your own pivot table style so that you can apply to all pivot tables without doing them one by one. Perfect. The sixth best practice is to set up auto refresh of pivot tables. For those who use pivot tables a lot, we know that pivot table does not automatically refresh. You can only refresh by right-click the pivot table and click refresh. But sometimes your users may forget to refresh and still left with unrefreshed data in the pivot table, which is very, very dangerous and risky. So how to build a mechanism to auto-refresh the pivot table whenever people select that pivot table or that tab or open that workbook. And next I'm going to show you the trick. We need to use VBA code, ActiveWorkbook.RefreshAll. Put it into the VBA panel so that you can assign it to a button or a worksheet. Let me show you how. The first way to refresh is to click the pivot table, right-click, and click refresh. That's very manual. For automated refresh, one way to do this is right-click the pivot table and then click Pivot Table Options. Go to Data. pivot table data section, you have one box for refresh data when opening the file. You can check the box and click OK. Now, pivot table will give you a warning saying, from now on, whenever you open this workbook, data will be refreshed in the other reports as well. Click OK. So this solves part of the problems, which is when you open this workbook, the data refreshed. But how about we make changes to the data after we have opened the workbook? The pivot table will not be refreshed automatically. We can only do that by using a VBA code. Now let's press and hold Alt F11 to open the VBA panel. To learn more details on how to write a VBA macro, feel free to sign up my Excel course called Excel Magic 2, Building Your Own Reporting Generating Bot. So for this course, I'm only going to show you how you can build a macro to auto-refresh your pivot table. So in the VBA panel, click Insert, a module, and then put this code in there. So basically, this is a refresh all macro. The macro is just one line, active workbook.refresh all. And let's click Save and close and load. Now, once that's done, let's add a button by going to Insert, Illustrations, Shapes. I will usually add a rectangle. Right-click the rectangle, assign the macro. We just create one macro, refresh all, click OK. And let's put some words into the button. For example, click to refresh all pivot tables. We can make this bigger. Now, check this out. Let's go to Data and make changes to one of the cell. Let's, for example, put in 1 million, a super large number. Now, coming back to the pivot tables, let's refresh all pivot tables. Ideally, we should be seeing some changes in here. Let's click Refresh all pivot tables. Once it's refreshed, it's showing a new number reflecting the changes. Okay, this is equivalent to right-click, refresh. How about we put the macro inside this tab so that every users who make the changes in the data table, coming back to this tab and click this tab, all of a sudden all pivot tables will refresh without you even clicking any of the buttons to refresh all pivot tables. How about that? So we can go back to our pivot table panel. This time, let's select Sheet 6 Best, where we have the pivot tables. Click the drop-down list for General and select Worksheet. And then on the right drop-down list, let's select Activate rather than Selection Change. Meaning when we select this worksheet, the macro will be activated. So let's delete the second one and simply put in active workbook.refresh tab. Let's save this and exit. Okay, now check this out. We already have the 1 million in there. Remove the 1 million and put the formulas back in so that when we go back to the best tab, the pivot tables will be refreshed and we can see the original grand total, 13 million. Now let me click best, and all of a sudden the pivot table is refreshed and you will be seeing this 14 million change to 13 million as it happens. Okay, we just learned the ways to automatically refresh pivot tables so that we can make sure that whenever you look at the pivot tables, it displays the most updated data. So in my opinion, this lack of auto refresh in the pivot table is the bug in Microsoft Excel, which I believe Microsoft will work to solve this bug in the future. To sum up, in this tutorial, we talked about 6 best practices of pivot tables. First, do set up data list as data table. Second, do assign a table name. Third, do put multiple pivot tables in multiple tabs. 4. Do protect sensitive information. 5th, do create your own pivot table style. And last, do set up auto refresh of pivot tables. Okay, that's the end of this tutorial. Feel free to connect and share with me via my LinkedIn, email, and website. Happy learning!